yes, I can. The Wasteland's centenary of publication is this year. It was published for the first time in 1922. And it's a very, very major text. And so it did seem a good year to be celebrating it. And I was working during the lockdown with quite a large group of poets across the West Country on Zoom, because we couldn't meet in person. And somehow we drifted into talking about the Eliot centenary, and a large number said, oh goodness, I could never get to terms with The Wasteland. It's so difficult. It was so scary. And I thought, that's a challenge. That's a good challenge for the pandemic. So we took it on. We as a group took it on, and I agreed to give a series of workshops on The Wasteland, which we called The Wasteland Revisited. And it might have gone nowhere, except the writing that those writers, 27 writers, were doing was so brilliant. I thought, wow, we can make a show out of this. Let's go for it. Let's look forward to beyond the pandemic. And we'll do something live with all this wonderful writing. And that's what we've done. I think the first thing that made it revolutionary is it was an English poet, an English language poet, writing for an English language audience, but with a tremendously deep knowledge of European poetry, and particularly French poetry at the time, which was, compared to the English scene, so very, very avant-garde and very intellectual and very challenging. And so everything he did was in a way challenging the English tradition by really saying the French do it so much better, you know. And it was totally revolutionary. And I think you would say that poetry that after The Wasteland that hadn't absorbed what Eliot did was dead in the water. I think that's still true. Still true. It's still a very revolutionary text. And it's odd because Eliot was not a revolutionary person. He was just passionate about what the French were doing in the arts. So it's equivalent almost to Impressionism. Nobody could touch the French. Well, he said nobody can touch the French in what they're doing in poetry. So I think that's probably the answer to how revolutionary, why it's so revolutionary. But it's become a revolution in its own right. It revolutionised all English language poetry afterwards. Yes, I can tell you, by really telling you a bit backwards, that Eliot very deliberately did not write as a topical poet of his day. He was writing it through the period of the First World War, and yet truthfully there's not a single reference to the First World War in the whole thing. He's a kind of timeless poet. He's writing in archetypes, and he's writing about things that are archetypically important. So that what's important in 1922, if it's really important, is just as important in 2022, which is where we are. So that's what makes him so ideal as a poet to study a century on, because quite honestly, it could be yesterday a lot of this poem was written, especially now we've got the climate catastrophe, the pandemic, and the Ukrainian war, and everyone, you could read The Wasteland and say this poem has got something to say to us. Oh yes. My aunt used to work for the Oxford University Press, and she always gave me lovely books for my birthdays and Christmas. And she gave me Old Possum's book of Practical Cats, I should think when I was about 10, and I fell in love with it. And then a bit later on, I found myself teaching English in Clare College in Cambridge. And to my great delight, I was teaching part of the syllabus, 1910 to 1945, English literature, and there was T.S. Eliot. But we didn't do the Practical Cats. I think I would actually take the 4 quartets, because I haven't taught it yet, and I want to. So I'd spend my time on the desert island getting my workshop